Okay, hello, my name is David Henstock. I'm in our global product team at Visa, where I head up our identity product group. I'd like to thank the FIDO Alliance and the organizers of the Authenticate conference for giving Visa the opportunity to speak and share some of our thoughts and perspectives on FIDO and financial services. This is a very timely and salient topic, one that's consuming a significant portion of my time, my team's time, and my colleagues as we look to bring together a number of concepts, certainly payments and authentication programs and technologies, but also regulation, fraud protection, and user experience, all the while intersecting with the digital transformation efforts that our financial services, seller, and fintech partners are actively involved in. So at Visa, we approach identity from two angles. First, from a fraud prevention angle. What are the signals that we can use to keep out the bad actors and bad behaviors from our ecosystem? And second, what are the products and services that we can build and deliver to help drive better outcomes within that broader payments context? And here is where FIDO has a significant role to play, and I'll talk more about that later. Before we go too far, I must make sure you read all our legalese. There you go. So I find it useful to start with the intelligent security framework that we've built, because you often think of Visa only as a payment company, but we're really involved end-to-end from account onboarding and management through authentication, certainly, authorization from a payment perspective, and so on. Visa has a long history in payment security and authentication, both in the face-to-face world and in the digital world. As technologies like chip and PIN improved defenses in the face-to-face world, as we all know, fraud moved online. So we developed payment authentication technologies like 3D Secure to help sellers and financial institutions share information in order to drive out fraud and ultimately lead to higher payment transaction approvals, with the thinking, approve all the good transactions, decline all the bad ones. Along with our EMV partners, we developed the 3DS 2.0 specification known as EMV 3DS, which provides 10 times more signals, along with risk-based or silent authentication to provide a frictionless experience for the end customer. However, fraud, like most things, don't stand still. It's dynamic and always goes to the weakest link. What we've seen is fraud move upstream from payment authentication, where as an industry, we have a number of solutions, to account authentication, where there were fewer and often less robust solutions. So when I talk to our issuers, our sellers, the question always comes up, what can Visa do to help fight account takeover fraud, to defend against data breaches, scams, phishing attacks? And the culprit, more often than not, is KBA, knowledge-based authentication, or simply put, passwords. And I highly recommend, if you have time later in the conference, tune into the Javelin session where they'll go in more detail on the latest trends in fraud. Even for someone like myself who's in identity and thinks about it all day and is rigorous about managing passwords, it's just become unmanageable. We need a better way. We need a standards-driven approach, and a big part of that is FIDO. So the most interesting and complex market from a payments perspective and regulatory and authentication perspective is Europe. As part of PSD2, the Strong Customer Authentication, or SCA, regulation came into effect for most of Europe this past December. The UK, which is our largest market from a payments perspective, follows this coming September. The SCA regulation must be applied for all electronic payments, which means that 2 out of the 3 factors, knowledge, inherence, possession, must be present to meet the regulatory standard. And it's the responsibility of the cardholder's issuing bank to ensure SCA compliance. And I note here in yellow, you have the opportunity as an issuer to outsource that authentication to a third party. So more on that later. As the slide here lists, there are certainly some exemptions, types of payments that are out of scope, small dollar transactions, consumers can whitelist merchants. However, if you're doing digital commerce in Europe, you must abide by the SCA regulations. So from a payments perspective, that creates a number of unique challenges. Imagine I'm online at my favorite seller, I'm ready to check out and pay. Well, how does my issuing bank authenticate me? Well, there is 3D Secure, so that's the channel by which the mechanism that sellers and issuers can authenticate and exchange information, and it's proved effective. It reduces fraud, reduces false declines, increased good orders, and approvals are always higher when the transactions are authenticated. However, due to the regulation, there are some restrictions. Risk-based authentication, which as an industry we've invested in as a way of doing that frictionless authentication, is not yet supported by the regulation. Similarly, one-time passwords only count as a possession factor, not as an inherence factor. So where does the issuer get that second factor? Well, there are a couple ways. You can do an out-of-band authentication, which means during the payment flow, the issuer you can out-of-band authenticate with the mobile banking app. But that has some challenges. It interrupts your shopping experience, what the sellers don't like. And not all consumers have downloaded their mobile banking app. Another way is knowledge-based authentication, PINs or passwords. But that unwinds all the good work as an industry that we've been trying to do. One of the solutions that Visa and the networks have come up with is called Delegated authentication. As I mentioned earlier, issuers can delegate the responsibility of authentication to a seller. In many cases, the seller is in a better position to collect those two factors. Maybe they have a mobile banking, a mobile shopping app of their own, and they're within that same shopping experience. This is where we see FIDO providing significant value. One, it's an easy way for sellers to meet that two-factor authentication. Both the inherence and the possession factor can be met with the FIDO standard. Second, FIDO is an easy way to upgrade from usernames and passwords to a more secure standard, upgrading that native authentication experience that the sellers have. And third, it provides a better, more easy to use customer experience for authentication. So at Visa, we're working and undertaking with our colleagues to make this in Europe a great, repeatable, and secure experience. We're doing a number of things. We're promoting the adoption of FIDO within our seller community. We're driving adoption of programs like the Delegated Authentication program within our issuer community. We're enabling FIDO as a native standard within 3D Secure, and also adding additional program capabilities to drive further support. Working with the broader 3DS ecosystem with the 3D servers, the MPI plugins to the sellers, also on the other side with the ACS for the issuers to enable the flow of not just payment authentication information, but also these FIDO credentials between the sellers and the issuers. We're also exploring ways to further utilize FIDO, for example, transaction confirmation, also in tokenization for binding payment credentials to a device using the FIDO protocol. Our goal is to refine these flows and then roll these out to other markets who may not have the same regulatory framework, but will benefit from having a consistent and secure payment and authentication experience. Again, I'd highly recommend tuning in later. There's a session on optimizing UX for strong authentication. One of the Visa design directors, who's also on the FIDO UX working group and is based in Europe, is actively working with me on these efforts and can share more of her insights during that session. So that is a very quick intro to FIDO and financial services. If you have further questions, please feel free to email me or use the email address on the slide. We'd be more than happy to share details both on FIDO as well as the identity and authentication products we're developing in the space. Thank you and have a great conference.